How far does the waterfall go? Walk down and have a look. What a spectacular yes, that's magnificent. There's so many wild rivers left, you know. All so many of the rivers have been dammed or turned into resorts. It's just amazing to see a really wild river flowing.
La nuit est chaude et je vois que la lune est claire. Quelque chose plus vieux mais aussi plus nouvelle. Doucement Afrique, doucement vous entrez mon cœur. Et je sens au moment que la vie est belle.
Afrique unitago, Afrique ushongile, Afrique unitago, Afrique ushongile. Ni mweti ubasi saka mbilu yaku Africa. Afrique
la nuit est chaude,
Afrique ushongile, usiku zawena.
Quelque chose plus vieux. Doucement Afrique, quelque chose plus vieux. Je sens
Well, in my, 17 years of going down the Wild Coast, I've always driven around the Inyameni Falls. And this time I thought I had to make darn sure I climbed right down the rocks to the bottom, and I do not regret having done so. The sun has just come to greet us, perfectly timed.
The illness is in the body, the pandemic is in society. I first came across that insight in 2002 when I was trying to get my head around my new job with the Africa Regional Office of the World Health Organization to advocate for support for their humanitarian response to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Southern Africa was the epicenter of that virus, and aggravated by persistent drought conditions and state incapacity across the SADC region, there was growing mortality and immense suffering. Now, 18 years on, we have another illness infecting bodies and another pandemic, far more global, contaminating society. And until scientists are able to find a vaccine to immunize our bodies from the illness, well, it's going to be up to us to work within society to manage and contain its spread. Now, in the slipstream of my previous conversation with the futurist, Professor Sohail Inayatullah, on his alternative future scenarios for a COVID-19 world, I've invited two people to grapple with the challenge of how to address the pandemic in society. Firstly, an anthropologist and futurist, Marguerite Coetzee, and an educationalist from the Human Sciences Research Council, Dr Michael Cosser. Before I ask them to introduce themselves, let me quickly add some more framing. That line, the illness is in the body and the pandemic is in society, leapt out at me from a textbook written by two distinguished academics, Tony Barnett, an applied anthropologist, and Professor Alan Whiteside, a health economist from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. It was published in 2002, and they went on to say, since 1916 there's been a division between medicine concerned with the health of the individual and one concerned with the health of populations. The 20th century saw many radical transformations of medicine. Among the most spectacular were vaccination, antibiotics, and the discovery of DNA and the consequent understanding of the genetic code. There were also regrettable developments. The transition of the control of medicine from the practitioners into the laboratory being one, and they go on to emphasize. Of great importance in the present context is that the division of medicine into individual and public health resulted in a split in the perception of health and well-being, which has not been repaired. And one of the lessons of the HIV/AIDS pandemic is that this schism must be repaired. It costs lives and causes suffering. Of course, the context that they were referring to was the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Today, that same statement could be said of the Corona-19 pandemic, except at a much wider scale. So why haven't we learned anything over the last 20 or so years. Well, after I'd finished my 3-year stint with WHO, I was asked to write a chapter for a textbook, which I titled The Road to Wellness, Boosting Community Immunity to HIV/AIDS. But if I may quote myself, this is one of the things I said. Besides the fragmentation of knowledge between public and individual health interests within the discipline of medicine, another schism exists between public health practitioners coming from a narrow biomedical perspective and those who advocate for psychosocial and or socio-cultural approaches. Before HIV appeared, the World Health Organization and the public health community were increasingly realizing that pain is what the patient says it is, not what the doctor defines it to be. It was that concern that spurred me to start this Tough Minds, Tender Hearts and Steady Hands series on YouTube to try and distill wisdom from in the midst of this pandemic. So to have another bite at the apple, I'm delighted to have both an elder in Michael and a younger, Marguerite. By the way, Margie was referred to me by my previous guest, Sohail Inayatullah, and he had drawn on some of her images and explaining his COVID-19 scenario, so there's a connection. Marguerite, tell us about yourself.
I completed my studies in social anthropology at WITS, and I was mostly interested, in understanding identity and how our context or our environment shapes who we are and our behaviors. From there, when I moved to Cape Town, I decided to complete a degree in Futures Studies at Stellenbosch Business School. That's where I'm at right now. I'm trying to combine anthropology and futures in the work that I do.
Yeah, because you're also an artist. I mean, tell me a bit about your artwork.
I think it was in 2006. I attended my first Johnny Clegg concert, and I was in such awe after attending my first performance of his, and I wanted a way to capture that without reducing it or simplifying it. I just wanted to have that memory forever. So what I did is I got myself a camera, and every time I went to a music event, I would photograph the quiet in-between moments. When a musician just stops before a song, I wanted to capture those human moments, not the performative aspects or when they put on their stage persona. And just from there, I fell in love with this idea of being able to capture certain perspectives or tell certain stories visually that can't always be put into words or can't always be relived. So I guess photography is a medium through which I could tell stories.
But before I introduce Mike, let me read a lovely paragraph from what Marguerite has written recently. Quote, "In Hindu mythology, it is believed that the earth is balanced on the backs of elephants, which are themselves supported by a world turtle. Below that turtle, another turtle. It is turtles all the way down. In complexity and systems thinking, it could be argued that a proposition requires justification, and the justification itself needs to be supported. No idea exists in isolation, no truth in a vacuum, no experienced untethered from others. It is turtles all the way down." And then another sentence which grabbed my attention, she says, "Epidemics are a category of disease that seem to hold up a mirror to human beings as to who we really are. It reflects the relationship between people and their environments, raising questions about our ways of life."
So the idea behind that, as you mentioned earlier, is that you can't have a statement or an idea existing in isolation. It's part of a bigger system or network with different forces of change that influence it. So if we're looking at a crisis or a pandemic, it's not a standalone situation. It's not something that's going to exist now and then stop and not exist again. So when we talk about a pre-COVID world or a post-COVID world, essentially what's going to happen is the old world as we know it, we've left behind and we're going to emerge into these post-normal times. So it's not about a new normal, it's not a new version of the normal that we know, it's post-normal. It's going to be something totally different and unexpected. So it definitely is worth looking at things in context and looking at how the different factors interact and are interconnected. We can't just look at it as a health pandemic. What other aspects contribute to it? For example, a lot of people are saying that the virus is an equalizer, but in South Africa we know more than anyone that no one experiences the pandemic equally. We've got a large population that maybe experiences poverty, or they've got pre-existing medical conditions, or they live in informal settlements and they cannot physically adhere to the conditions of physical distancing. So the experience of the pandemic is already complicated. So we have to look at things in context.
Mike, tell us about yourself. Where are you coming from?
Yes, I am Michael Cosser. I work at the Human Sciences Research Council in democracy, governance, and citizenship. My background is actually originally it was in English literature and language studies, and then it was education. And I've worked most of my life in education and skills development. And just for the last few years, been working in democracy and governance. And yeah, I make soap, I cycle, I'm married and have 6 children, 2 of my own and 4 stepchildren. And yeah.
What Mike is too really modest to tell us is that he is a soap maker, having converted his initial passion from saving the planet from polluting waterways and landfills with leftover soap. He turned it into a business that actually supplies luxury soap and hand sanitizer to what he calls discerning customers. So now that we all have to wash our hands, Mike's going to corner the market. Okay, Marguerite, I know that your whole reconceptualization of the COVID crisis using metaphors is very much still a work in progress, and you've shared with me a draft paper. But share some of your emerging ideas about the emergent and the dominant narratives, and hopefully we can use this platform as a way of fleshing them out still further.
Okay, so as a preface to these metaphors, there's this statement that is going around where people are saying that the pandemic did not break the system, but rather it has exposed a broken system. So we find ourselves in this suspended moment on the one hand, as well as these societal fault lines are rapidly, surfacing and deepening, and we're having to face them quite quickly. So John, as you mentioned, the pandemic is holding up this mirror to society, and we're having to confront our realities, memories, imaginings, and what makes us human. Sohail Inayatullah developed the sense-making tool called Causal Layered Analysis. It is a way for us to map our experiences, unpack the issues we face, and even reconstruct the path we are on simply by changing the stories that we tell. So imagine a pyramid that has been divided into 4 layers. The very first layer at the top is the litany, or the observed or obvious problem that you would most likely hear about in the news or see posted on social media. Below that, the second layer is the systemic causes or driving forces that create the conditions in which the problem exists. The third layer is where you find the discourses and ideological assumptions that legitimize and support a particular worldview. And the fourth layer, at the very foundation of the pyramid, is the myth and metaphor layer. This is linked to long-term history and often has emotive dimensions. I'd like to take you through some dominant and emergent pandemic narratives that I have come across. Each comes with its own set of challenges and opportunities, benefits and downfalls. There is this idea in the social sciences that we only see what we expect to see, and what we expect to see is what we are conditioned to see. So the aim of this exercise is to change the way that we see and experience the pandemic that we're in. As a starting point, I've used the steep analysis framework to categorize the different metaphors that I have observed. STEEP stands for Society, Technology, Economy, Environment, and Politics.
Let's just pause there, because I love the way that you capture this multi-dimensional rendering of reality. And depending on which one you are located as the dominant one, you will tend to see the pandemic through that particular lens. And I'm just reminded of that saying, we do not see the world as the world is, we see the world as we are. But what I really like about the structure of this process is that the pandemic is forcing us to question the assumptions from all 5 of those perspectives. Because part of our problem in society, it seems to me, is that social realities become so fragmented because each of those 5 conceptual spaces would like to think they're right. So maybe it's a case of us all being forced now by this pandemic to climb down off our high horses and hobby horses that we like to gallop away to reinforce our own view of the world and say, well, maybe there is a view of reality that is larger than each of us can bring to the table. Now, I know this is still, as we said earlier, a work in progress, and you're still fleshing out how in each of the 5 domains of human endeavor, there's a fruitful process of drilling down to get to the root metaphor and to generate alternative emergent metaphors. But what's interesting is if we start cross-pollinating between them, and just by way of illustration, maybe you can just share with us the dominant narrative from the political sphere and the emergent narrative from the environmental sphere, because that seems to me to be probably the most important deep learning issue that we need to grapple with.
In the political realm, the dominant narrative, which I'm sure we've seen everywhere, is this idea that the pandemic is a war and the virus is our enemy, and we have to do everything in our power to fight this enemy. We need to eliminate the threat. It's a threat to human life as well as to national security. And sometimes we're willing to eliminate it even by violent means. Citizens then become soldiers, and it becomes our duty to fight to protect ourselves and our country at all costs. A more positive alternative to this is perhaps the pandemic as a type of game or a game of chess, where the virus is our challenger, and we need to apply logic and strategy and think ahead and plan ahead in order to come out victorious. Then we've got the environmental realm. So the dominant narrative that we're seeing here is the pandemic as disaster. It's this idea of a disruptive collapse. It's either a natural process or it's by human influence. And what governments are trying to do is put regulations into place as if, trying to minimize the damage or to control the spread of this disease. And the problem here is that people kind of become victims or volunteers rather than being agents of change. A more positive metaphor that could be used here in the environmental realm is this idea of pandemic as a river. What this then does is that the idea of healing becomes a journey. And in order to make it through this journey, you need to develop a map to navigate the landscape. But it's also important to consider who created the map, who is the map for, and what is the intention of the map. So you want to be able to anticipate any emergencies or turbulence, but you also want it to be able to adapt to the changing landscape. And what happens here then is people become explorers who are able to go on their own path or connect with others. So it's more of a collaborative journey. So the main point here is that many of the dominant pandemic metaphors encourage destructive discourses and promote ideas of separation or superiority. The emerging metaphors are more transformational, that promote interconnectedness and a process of change. There are different ways of seeing, framing, and being in the world, and the language we use and the metaphors we apply shape the way we experience reality and imagine possibilities and take on responsibility.
From your perspective, Mike, does this resonate? And
your image of a river got me thinking about another pandemic or epidemic, which happened in 1976. Ironically, while there was an outbreak of another kind in Soweto, there was an outbreak of a disease called Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in fact, it wasn't for some time called Ebola. It didn't have a name. It was given that name by one of the epidemiologists from the Centers for Disease Control in the States, who was in the Congo. And one evening, he and some friends, epidemiologists, were drinking Kentucky bourbon in vast quantities and were casting about for a name, and they couldn't really find one very easily. So they then hit on the name of the river that was nearest Yambuku, the town where the outbreak had happened. So Ebola is a river. And what I find interesting about a river, and it picks up, Marguerite, on some of the points you're making here, is that it flows regardless. You know, we can try and dam it up, we can try and alter its course, but there's an inexorability about the flow of a river. That got me thinking in turn about polyvagal theory, of all things. I'm not sure if you're familiar with polyvagal theory and the way it's been linked to different states of freeze, fight and flight, fright, flag, faint. And of course, I'd like to add the seventh here, which is flow. So how do we get from freeze, fight and flight, fright, flag, and faint to flow? We can have different responses to this pandemic, which could be any one of those Fs. The only appropriate one would be flow.
let's just pause there and let the and let the flow kind of resurface. Right? What I really loved in terms of the emerging narrative is about developing a map and healing as a journey. When I first got involved in my magnificent obsession on the Wild Coast, it was on an Amadiba horse trail, and we simply rode horses along the beach of the Wild Coast. And I'd never been there before in my life, with my family now. And there was a sense in which I looked inland and I wondered what was there, because we only really entered along the coast from the Wild Coast sun. And the metaphor that came to mind was, you know, when the medieval map makers would write their maps, and they'd only go so far as to be able to get some of the map done. And on the fringes, they would write, "Here be dragons," because they were nervous about the fact that they didn't want people to go wandering off and getting lost in an unmapped territory. And that idea of the dragon as a fearful thing, that's to constrain you to stay in the familiar. Now, one of my next conversations, and the reason I'm wanting to make this point, is with a friend of mine who I've got to know through Facebook. She is a Celtic mystic, I call her, from Wales. And she was saying how for her, the dragon has been demonized, whereas in actual fact, it's about befriending the dragon. So you see how that sort of ties in beautifully. We don't have a map, we're fearful of the dragons, but if we allow our fear to be transcended, well, we will actually find, as was my whole experience being on the Wild Coast, in getting to know the community inland, has been the most liberating transformational experience. Marguerite, what's this saying to you?
Yes, so I love that. That's an amazing story of the dragon. It reminds me of also the idea of fire, where in South Africa we've got this saying that dry, dead grass is made new again by fire. So sometimes things need to be dismantled and, you know, destroyed essentially for it to rebuild and regrow and maybe even be stronger than before. So I love this idea of the dualities, and it can't always all be good or all be bad or one or the other. Sometimes it can be both. And also just on the topic of the Ebola River, Michael, you reminded me of this conversation I had with someone on the idea of blood river, and perhaps that is more realistic for South Africa as a foundation of where we come from and what we can maybe anticipate could happen again, or something similar, or we could draw on our past experiences and anticipate a similar kind of scenario playing out. What could a blood river in the context of a pandemic such as coronavirus look like? And how do we prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I spoke earlier about the notion of us trying to dam up a river, and, you know, in the context of its, well, the impossibility of doing that, its inexorable flow. And that has been the response of many people to COVID-19. They've tried to dam it up. Damming up suggests you can stop it so that we can then return to where we were before the pandemic. So it's just a little hiccup along the way. You know, we need to get back to making money, driving our cars, you know, all the things that we associate with our lifestyle. So I guess the question is, how does this event give us pause and enable us to work through what the pandemic might mean for us in a way that doesn't automatically cause us to want to just return to life as it was?
Well, if I may just also pick up with that, it just works beautifully. I mean, one of the discoveries that was so transformational for me in my work in the Amadiba was to discover the Inyameni River, which is a river which flows right through the middle of that 22-kilometer stretch which they want to mine. And it has the most extraordinary cascading waterfall. That Inyameni, as you know, Marguerite being a linguist, means the dark place, the black place. Now, there was also that idea of the dragon, the fearful thing. And the school that became the center of part of the struggle against the mining was a high school built across the Inyameni River. And the founder of the school said, look, I'm not going to build this high school closer to the road and more accessible. It's people who are further away that need this education. And he established a high school there. And there's a whole story behind the Baleni Senior Secondary School, which I write about.
Sorry, John, just an aside. Ebola means Black River in
Does it? Yes.
Lingala, the local language. So if you are into synchronicity, there's one.
Wow.
So thousands of years ago, communities the world over acknowledged that there was a relationship between society and nature. If there was turmoil or conflict in society, it would appear in the environment in the form of drought, fire, or disease. Nature was seen to be this self-replicating entity that was not to be disturbed or exploited. If you took something out, you needed to put something back. And it is only more recently that the Western community made this discovery called the Anthropocene, or the climate crisis. So I guess it raises the question that could COVID-19 and these climate pandemics, could it be a reflection of a social ill? What societal ills are playing out through this pandemic?
And how's this for an interesting synchronicity? In 2008, a late friend of mine, Steve DeGrucci, first got me thinking about the creative use of metaphor to reframe reality, to reimagine our futures and create a new transformational narrative. Now, he was a professor of theology at the University of KZN, and he'd been observing the growing polarization between the greens and the browns in the Ponderland Wild Coast, Samuel and their political supporters in government were still trying to control the narrative by highlighting the poverty, unemployment and lack of development, which Steve described as the Brown agenda, and they were of course arguing that the toll road was a solution to those problems. Ranged against that was the strong environmentalist lobby. And for many years we were characterized and unjustly caricatured, I think, as greenie beanies, as people who only cared about the environment, pursuing the green agenda. Now Steve came up with this marvelous transformational metaphor of the olive agenda, which really inspired me. I mean, it expressed so beautifully everything that I stood for as a social worker. Firstly, obliged by my professional code of practice to always champion the interests of the poor and the most vulnerable, the brown concerns. And then as an environmentalist, as from my days as a Boy Scout, I was very much into the green issues. And then, of course, as a Christian pacifist, committed to peace building, truth and reconciliation, which of course is symbolized by the olive branch. So in one of my first attempts at filmmaking, I interviewed Steve, and I will put a link up for those who are interested, because it just resonates so beautifully to your point about the relationship between humanity and nature. Because in the conversation, Steve and I talk about the 7 plagues that we read about in the book of Exodus as being, in fact, manifestations of a massive ecological disruption.
When things go wrong between human beings, the earth is going to react with locusts, with frogs, with flood. The root metaphor theologically is the question of life. Life is not divisible. Our human life is part of the earth life, and earth life is part of the life that water gives us and air gives us, and the life of the fertility of the earth and the fertility of our lives. And to choose life, which is such a profound moral choice that Moses puts before the people as they are about to cross the Jordan River and enter this land where they have to balance the economy against the ecology to make it a land flowing with milk and honey, where the widow and the alien and the orphan have justice. The River Jordan is this umbilical cord that links the water of life, the Galilee, rising in the Lebanon hills and flowing into Galilee, and with the waters of death at the Dead Sea. And I would imagine,
actually, in a tragic irony, a few months after I interviewed Steve and we talked at length about rivers and the flowing of new life, he drowned tragically in an accident while tubing down the Moy River. So I'm telling that story at length to keep his extraordinary use of transcending and transformational metaphors alive. And it explains why I'm particularly inspired by your own use of the river and the flowing of the river as a better metaphor for understanding the pandemic.
and I think the choice for life then is not just human life over and against other human life, but it really is human life in dialogue with the fertility of the life of this earth.
It actually reminds me of this debate that is going around where people are saying that the virus is an equalizer because it affects everybody. No one is immune to it. But on the other hand, people experience it in different ways. And those who are vulnerable are experiencing it to more extremes. So I guess the analogy to use then is that we're all in the same storm, but we're not on the same boat.
What boat should we be on? What does it need? What are the characteristics of the vessel that we need that will carry us through this?
I guess anything that would equip us to deal with any obstacles that we come across, something that would be able to adapt to the terrain and be prepared for any situation or scenario, but not so rigid that it can't change if it needs to.
Yeah, well, within systems thinking, I mean, my inspiration was Stafford Beer. He used the word cybernetics. And the very word cybernetics is from the Greek, kubernetes, which means the steersman. You know, and that our way of negotiating our way through very complex systems is to actually have those feedback loops that enable us to learn our way through it
So it's not just, well, you plot a course and you follow it. There has to be a kind of a consciousness that's within that vessel, whether it be Noah's Ark or an aircraft carrier today, of knowing what waters we're in, what the risks, what the threats are, and to basically make sure that we are learning our way through it. And what has it done for you? I'm just interested to know, as a younger, deeply thoughtful person whose future is still mainly ahead of you, tell us a bit about how you personally are processing this.
I'm so happy you asked this question, because there was actually something I wanted to share with you. So on a side note, what this pandemic has done for me is challenge the way that I see the world. And just as you mentioned, how do I frame my reality? At the beginning of the lockdown in South Africa, I was questioning, the language that we use to describe our experience. Even just the word lockdown makes it feel like we're criminalized, or our movements are so restricted and certain things are banned, or it just puts a lot of strain on the social side of humanity, which is also where your point comes in on physical distancing. But on the point of language, in isiZulu, the word vuka, but spelled with a K, means to wake up or awaken or an awakening. And the word tuna, spelled TH, is translated to grave or tomb, and can also be used to mean inappropriate or unsuitable. So just from a South African perspective, these two words seemed quite negative and not really suitable to the times that we're in. So instead, what came to mind is this isiZulu word dela, which I propose could stand for dynamic, emergent, liminal, and anthropocentric. What this means is that the times we're in is ever changing. We're in a process of being and becoming, and we're in this in-between state of transition where everything is focused on humanity, but humanity also has the biggest impact on our environment. So if you translate the word dela, it has two paradoxical definitions. On the one hand, dela means to be satisfied or to have had enough. And on the other hand, dela means to abandon or to give up or sacrifice. So I felt that this word just captured this duality that we're in. It creates a better sense of agency and a bit of hope and ability to create the change we want.
I'm reminded of what René Descartes said. We do not describe the world we see. We see the world that we can describe. Your use of photography as a way of capturing a moment and then allowing that to sort of interpenetrate your consciousness to bring forth a sort of a greater capacity to describe the world. And I'm almost envious of you as artists because you have that ability. And I mean, that metaphor also of the pandemic as war, as this battling to fight. I mean, that is, from my social media, from my Facebook, I've heard so many people coming and saying, why do we have to keep using this militaristic metaphor? And because the implicit worldview of that is one in which we need to marshal our forces and we are going to beat it. And we're going to see it as the enemy that needs to be gotten rid of. But it brings to mind, getting back to the HIV/AIDS thing, something which one of my cousins taught me. He was HIV positive and one of the first people to be diagnosed in the early 80s, when it really was, before it was understood for what it is. He is still alive today. And Anthony told me once, we were having a conversation. I said, Anthony, what is it that's keeping you going? Because a lot of his friends had died. And he said, John, I had to befriend my virus. Now, it's in the sense of saying I had to learn to love my enemy. It still remains an enemy. It's still something that is a threat to you. But don't let the fear of the enemy dictate to you your response. Find a transformational, regenerative understanding. So this, for him, it was about befriending his virus, which now, 2020, he's still alive. In what ways do we need to befriend the coronavirus? I mean, that sounds like total heresy.
I think this is where Sohail's use of metaphor is so incredible, just because once you put something into terms that you understand, or a better way of, deciphering what this complex thing is, you can deal with it, process it, and accept it. So an example, I was talking to someone who was explaining in Zulu what cancer is. And the way that they described it is they've got a home in a rural area in KwaZulu-Natal. And inside this home is a wooden beam that holds up the roof. And for him, cancer is like a white termite that comes and devours this support beam. So for him, that just was a way for him to process and understand what cancer does to the human body. So an example of just the power of narrative and perspective, if you say that you are stuck at home versus you're safe at home, it already changes your experience of being at home. So just seeing it in a positive light versus the negative already just, changes your experience. Just having conversations with people I know in different parts of the country, there are some people I know who are complaining about not being able to exercise when they want to, or not being able to order takeaways, or just those small luxuries that they have grown accustomed to and have now had to sacrifice. And for them, it's quite painful. Whereas there are other people that I've spoken to who might be able to work from home, but they don't even have a desk to sit at. Or on the extreme, they maybe have lost their job, or they depend on physical labor and are no longer able to perform their jobs and are not generating an income and do not have a backup savings plan. So for them, it's a very real reality that they could face starvation or violence or other extreme conditions that maybe someone who is safe at home would not be facing or even considering would be a reality for them.
And you describe the dominant narrative and contrast with the emergent narrative. But the dominant narrative is, it seems, the unconscious default of all unthinking citizens. They just fall into it rather than choose it. The emergent narrative is, in each of the five polarities, arises from consciousness and engagement and thinking about it. In the population at large, I can't imagine many respondents actually opting for the dominant narrative if they're given a choice. And it's just kind of this paradox.
But I think that, one of the things that has interested me throughout this pandemic coming to a head is the binarism that exists in the way people respond to it. I come across very few people who see things in terms of a continuum. So even people who provide balance will do so in terms of the polarities. They will say, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, and we must try and find balance. But I guess something that as I've grown older I've come to realize is the importance of seeing things in terms of nuance. I'm thinking now of Zapiro's cartoon this week, 50 Shades of Grey. That's Glenda Gray he's talking about. So it doesn't have to be 50 shades of grey, but there are shades of grey. That's the point. And, we need to try and, I think, see this pandemic in those terms. And it's very difficult to do so because, we are so, in Western thought, trained to see things in black and white, good and bad, right and wrong, that it's extremely difficult to kind of take a yin and yang approach. But I think that's what, we need to be doing.
Particularly when, I do think that people that in terms of research, it occurred to me that, okay, we can go and try and poll the population at large to see which narrative they follow. But I think a more fruitful thing is to critique the policies and utterances of people of influence in powerful positions in not only government, in business, and in civil society and churches and all the rest, and say, well, let's discern engage with them to see what is the implicit metaphor of reality that they're following. And I'm particularly sensitive to this over the way in which militarism has been used, because it took me way back to the 80s when the total onslaught strategy, this evil communist forces from outside, and therefore we all had to sign up to fight this evil. And of course, that led me and many of us to become conscious objectors, because we just simply could not buy into that binary. And I think power tends to like to create and reinforce those binaries, but ordinary people, I think, do have, given the opportunity, if they're seeking after truth, will naturally gravitate to a more holistic view of the world.
So I can maybe tell you a story. I was chatting to someone who is a first language Zulu speaker, and she was explaining to me what experience of lockdown is in Zulu terms. So she said that the word that is being used to describe lockdown is the same word you use for the sound a container makes when you close it. So it's also this idea that you can't reopen the container once it's closed. So if you've got a jar of biscuits and you close that jar, it stays closed. No one must open it again. So that it feels, the language that is being used feels quite oppressive and constraining. And just on a cultural side, some people are struggling with this physical distancing, where you are not allowed to shake hands anymore, where before shaking hands was a form of language and communication, where you could tell something about someone by the way that they shook your hand. So all of these cultural implications that are now, there's this ripple effect happening from the kind of restrictions and regulations being put into place. It's not always that obvious what the after effects might be. So it's just very interesting to see the different perspectives and the way that people are talking about the experience of the pandemic. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, and it also triggers another thought, and I can see us potentially going on for another hour. At the beginning of the thing, I was remembering in my social work undergraduate years, before the internet, this is in another millennium, the sociological studies on what they call 6 degrees of separation. And nowadays we've got YouTube, and I found it very interesting, short sort of explanation of that, well researched and well scientifically valid. And the guy made the point, he says, we are only 5.2 handshakes away from everyone else on the planet. Now, this was made about 2 years ago, before COVID came. I then thought to myself, isn't it ironic and rather sad that we now can't shake hands? That's why I'm so much on my hobby horse about not talking about social distancing, saying physical distancing, but that connection has never been more important. Obviously, social workers would tend to say social is important. What is emerging from this whole thing? And maybe our job is to just encourage people to not fear, because I think fear is what actually is the biggest enemy. The other thing is, who is it that said the only thing to fear is fear itself? And how we can somehow be a reassuring presence in society. How do you foresee your role within the future?
Wow, that is something I've grappled with quite some time. Not just my role in the future, but I think also my role in South Africa. I think there are so many things that we need to fight for and fight against. There's a term that I came across, syndemic, which indicates that there are multiple crises happening simultaneously, or there are different conditions that create multiple pandemics at the same time. And I feel like that is how it feels to deal with the world at present. not just because of the coronavirus, but just because there's so much that has not been dealt with in the past. There are fault lines and cracks that are starting to deepen and resurface, and often the youth is left to heal the past. So I think it's definitely a big burden to carry, but it's also very encouraging and empowering to know that we have the capability to create something different. John, you used some music by Claire Johnston in some of your previous episodes. I'm hoping maybe you could use a snippet of Mango Groove's Another Country. It was just making me think of this idea of, when we were during South Africa's transitional stage of moving from apartheid to a democracy. The song by Mango Groove also just captured this idea of we're coming from a state of fear and moving towards a sense of hope. The future is unknown, but it can't be any worse than where we came from. So it definitely feels like we're in this state again.
Well, Claire can definitely not say no now. After I share this with Claire, has been a great friend and supporter of our challenges on the Wild Coast. So that's wonderful. Another useful, lovely synchronicity.
I just wanted to make a point about language, which is a point Marguerite has been making as well, but perhaps in a different way. But the language we use to describe this pandemic and how we respond to it is, I think, revealing. So, the primary meaning of lockdown is, and this comes from a dictionary, a North American dictionary, the confining of prisoners to their cells, typically in order to regain control during a riot. So, what does this mean that, we can speak of lockdown in these terms? And, that's just one example of the way we respond to a situation like this. But, so it's interesting that terminology can actually not just reflect, but it can come to shape the way we respond to something.
I think just on the point of what makes us human, as humans, we have the capacity to tell stories, and stories become this tool that we use to make sense of the world. Stories are rooted in these past knowledge systems. They're also a means for us to make sense of different alternate realities and different perspectives. And they also have the potential to transform what is possible and where we're going. So it's really important to just be considerate of the language that we use and how we experience this transition that we're in.
Yeah, and the jokes we tell. I'm glad you mentioned Zapiro, because I interviewed him last year, and we had a wonderful conversation about his own narrative and how, his ups and downs, and somebody who has that very important role to play of speaking truth to power and capturing those nuances. Marguerite, thanks for saddling up my hobby horse again about the liberating power of story and narrative. You haven't watched my Caring Conversation series that I was doing last year, in which I really thought I had flogged that horse to death because of my repeated use of a wonderful quote from Ben Okri about the necessity of confronting the lies and the false narratives that we tell ourselves as individuals and as nations, and that's right at the front of my book as well. So when you get the copy, you can reflect on that and see how it works for you. But I don't need to read it again, because another great inspiration in my work is fellow social worker Brené Brown. Now, how about this for another synchronicity? Because just today I found this marvelous quote on her Facebook page, which, if you just let me read this, it just echoes so incredibly with what Ben Okri says. We either own our stories or they own us. Only when we have the courage to own our history are we able to write a brave new ending to our story. This is true in our lives, our families, our communities, and our country. And she says we can't call ourselves free or brave when we keep running from the truth. I see so far it's got 37,000 likes and loves, 11,000 shares. So clearly it's kind of struck a nerve. Bringing it back to the COVID-19 crisis, I see it as a golden opportunity for us to maybe even rewrite some of the old chapters of the book of our lives and to take ownership of the full truth thereof, as fearful as that may be, because Brené's research and my own experience as a social worker confirms this, is that even though having to go through that process of introspection and in confronting these deep, dark fears of our past does require courage, but the positive consequences of that, at least in my experience, will always tend to outweigh the negative consequences. So even though it really does take a bit of nerve, it is so worth doing, rather than remaining in denial and letting these untold histories of our past sort of torment us. In fact, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, in the back of my book, he does have this lovely quote. He says, "We must confront the ghosts of our past so that they don't return to haunt us in the future." And you also then get to write what Brené talks of a brave new ending, which is for me the most humanizing experience. Or to go back to Ben Okri again, he puts it so poetically. He says, if we face our own truth, we free our histories for future flowerings. Yes, it may feel like we're going out on a limb, but that's where the blossoms grow.
Doucement d'Afrique, doucement vous entrez mon cœur, et je sens au moment que la vie est belle.
I can play out with another wonderful song by Claire Johnson, Jeff Maluleke. In the post-production process, I got hold of Mango Groove to see if we could use a clip from another country, and John Layden, their business manager, was extremely helpful, and he told me that there was a recording of a live performance with Claire singing it in a duet with another icon of the South African music industry, Zolani Mahola of Freshly Ground. It was performed in a special Women's Day concert in Emerentia, Johannesburg 2 years ago, and I looked at it and thought I didn't want to spoil it by adding it into this as background music soundtrack, even though John and Gallo Music were willing to let me do so. So what I've done is put a link to the official YouTube version on an end screen, which you will get to shortly. It should be appearing around now with a thumbnail. I'm not sure where YouTube is going to place it, but if you click on that, you'll go straight into that one, and that's lovely bonus material for you to sing along to. Just alongside that, there will be another thumbnail as an advert to encourage you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. So please do that, because it'll really help me get beyond a certain threshold so that I can actually monetize this channel. I mean, YouTube apparently will only allow one to monetize your channels if you have more than 1,000 subscribers. I'm halfway there, and although these films are a labor of love rather to make money, it would be nice having a bit of an additional income to help me reach beyond my present grasp. Well, finally, let me quickly tell you about my next conversation. Now, building on that quote from Brené Brown, I have another extraordinary, tough-minded and tender-hearted friend, Professor Musa Manzi, who will be sharing how he has owned his own life story in a way that is just extraordinarily inspirational. And I happened to hear Eusebius Makaiser interviewing Musa, and I've never heard Eusebius wax so lyrical about anybody. In fact, let me just play a little bit from what Eusebius had to say in his podcast.
Eusebius Makaiser on 702.
But do not go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. I promise you, one of the most inspirational conversations I've had, the story of Professor Musa Manzi. Every single South African must listen. Make sure you don't go anywhere. You listen. His life story is amazing. It's moving. It's inspirational. And for this one, you're going to need some tissues. You are the definition of transcendence without being glib about the difficulties of transcending. all the tough things that life throws at you.
Well, I'm pretty sure that you're not going to want to miss that. So please remember to subscribe to my channel. And next to it, just ring the bell. There's a little kind of icon which will notify you when it's uploaded. And until then, go well.